Welcome to today's event. Before we begin, let me just do a quick bit of housekeeping to say that live captioning is available by clicking on the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to hand over today's proceedings to CAP's Senior Vice President for Rights and Justice, Nicole Lee Ndumele, who will also bring in two extraordinary mayors who are providing leadership on the front lines and who are going to give you their insights today. I'll do that in just a moment, but I want to establish just a little bit of some scene setting on the front end. There's a lot of recency bias in the media, so it's important to just all of us together reflect back to this time last year. Less than a quarter of Americans had a COVID-19 vaccine shot. Families were struggling. Unemployment was at an extraordinary 6%. Almost 1 in 5 children in America, in this country, the richest country ever in the history of humanity, 1 in 5 children were living in poverty. Then came the American Rescue Plan. A recent Moody's analysis found that the rescue plan was single-handedly responsible for well over 4 million new jobs in this economy that were created in the last year. And if that bill had not passed, the US likely would have suffered a double-dip recession and unemployment would have skyrocketed over 7% last summer. In addition, childhood poverty plummeted by 38% in 2021. And after the bill passed, at the bottom 80% of Americans by income had their net wealth increase by $2.6 trillion in the middle of 2 quarters of last year. 2.6 trillion with a T. This was a bill that put America back on track, passing without a single Republican vote, I might add. And now we can build on all of the extraordinary successes. At a time when Americans are feeling price hikes, the economic plan that President Biden and our leadership in Congress have proposed will lower healthcare costs, energy costs, and childcare costs. It will put money in pockets and deliver for American families. Congress has an opportunity to seize right now, right here in this hour. They and this administration have turbo boosted our economy once, and they can do it again. So I'm going to bring in Nicole, who will then bring in our mayor leaders. But I'm going to make one final note to just acknowledge my dear friend, Gene Sperling, who will be joining us later in this conversation. Gene is the White House, is leading in the White House. He's charged with directing the efforts around the American Rescue Plan. He previously served as director of the National Economic Council for President Clinton and for President Obama. He worked as a senior fellow here at CAP and is a longtime champion for American workers, using every lever at his disposal to lift up their voice and agency. In his role as White House coordinator for the American Rescue Plan, he's continued to work in that vein. So I'm just really thrilled that Gene's going to be able to join us for some part of the discussion today. Some of us are old enough to remember the last significant economic downturn when we had a stagnant recovery. With Gene's leadership and with all the lessons that we learned from that moment, it's been applied in ways that have enabled our mayors to lead and center workers in outcomes. So Nicole, I'm going to now turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you for those remarks and looking forward to today's conversation. I'm Nicole Ndumele, CAP's Senior Vice President for Rights and Justice, and I'd like to start where Patrick just ended with how far we've come in the past year and how much of an impact the American Rescue Plan has had on families across this country, not just in helping to kickstart the economy and create jobs, but also in alleviating much of the hardships so many Americans were feeling this time last year and still would be feeling if it weren't for the American Rescue Plan. Now, I'm thrilled to bring in our panelists who have invested rescue plan dollars in their communities to address inequities that have led to some communities being particularly hard hit, to support those, to provide essential services, and to address a host of other issues that were impacted by this pandemic. But first, let me do some quick introductions. So first, I would like to introduce Mayor Darrell Steinberg. He is the mayor of Sacramento. First elected in 2016, Mayor Steinberg previously served as the Democratic leader in the California State Senate As mayor, he has taken on difficult challenges like homelessness and economic inequity in Sacramento. He successfully campaigned for Measure U, a new 1-cent sales tax with the goal of investing in economic development, youth, and affordable housing. He's also worked with Governors Brown and Newsom to bring in millions of dollars in additional funding to address homelessness in Sacramento. Thank you, Mayor Steinberg, for being here today. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you so much, Nicole.
I also want to introduce Mayor Melvin Carter. Mayor Carter is the first African-American mayor of the city of St. Paul, Minnesota, and a fourth-generation St. Paul resident. Prior to becoming mayor, he served as a St. Paul City Council member, the director of the Minnesota Office of Early Learning, and the executive director of the Minnesota Children's Cabinet. And now as mayor, he's established College Bond St. Paul, an initiative which set up $50 for college savings account for every child born in the city, which started by this mayor on January 1st of 2020. And as Patrick Gaspard mentioned earlier, in addition to these two fabulous mayors and leaders, later we'll be hearing some closing remarks from Jean Sperling, the coordinator for the White House American Rescue Plan, on some of the implementation lessons that we've learned over the past year. But for now, let's jump into the panel conversation. So my first question is really for both of you. Can you offer some insights in how you were able to use ARP funds to develop a budget that prioritizing reduces economic hardship and poverty in your cities, while also addressing the other critical challenges of the pandemic?
Mayor Carter, please go first.
That's kind of you. I appreciate it. Thanks for having us on, Nicole. This is an honor. You know, I'm really excited about the investments that we're making with ARP dollars, and really appreciative of the opportunity. You know, the ability to make this type of infusion of investments in our businesses and our residents and our students is really unprecedented. But also, we can't just compare the opportunities that we're going to talk about today with sort of a standard baseline, because without American Rescue Plan funding, we would not be anywhere near a standard baseline. For our city budget, we think right around just over $50 million of lost revenue as a result of the pandemic. You know, and so, you know, without these funds, we'd be in a really seriously challenging position that would involve us, you know, in a conversation around layoffs and closing recreation centers and closing libraries in a way. So the first thing that I think that we're doing through the American Rescue Plan funds to help advance equity and opportunity is avoiding all of those draconian situations that we'd be in had this federal administration and this Congress not worked together to partner directly with cities and to partner directly with local, you know, kind of local municipalities. That's really critical. For St. Paul, our American Rescue Plan funds, we've put into what we're thinking of as kind of the big buckets of priorities. The first is housing. We partnered with our county just a couple of months ago to announce a pretty historic investment, a $74 million joint effort to fund over 1,000 units of housing for deeply affordable residents or for our lowest income neighbors at 30% area median income, which are kind of our hardest to fund population. We're putting a significant infusion into public safety. St. Paul, we started our kind of journey, as many of the folks viewing today know. Minnesota has been sort of at the heart of a global conversation around what public safety means and what it shouldn't mean. And we started this journey before, frankly, George Floyd was killed. And so we've put a significant part of our American Rescue Plan dollars into helping to advance and accelerate our conversation around what public safety can mean. That can include community interrupters. That includes kind of, you know, grants to neighborhood organizations who are doing good work on the ground. And that includes supports for law enforcement and, you know, some of the things that we've traditionally seen as public safety. And we're investing, and I'm excited about this, in our workforce. through like a work WPA type of lens to say, how do we address some of our infrastructure needs? How do we address some of our real needs in our city while putting our residents to work to kind of for the process of doing that? We have diseased trees that are impacted by emerald ash borer that we have an enormous amount of work to do to take down, to chop up, to replant. We can put our residents to work doing that. We have infrastructure needs with regards to potholes and street repaving and things like that that we can put to work. We have thousands of families who still have homes that are connected to our water main with lead pipes. And we are going to be investing where that's concerned. Our goal is to really think about zero barrier, or at least very low barrier to employment opportunities. I think of it as, some 20 years ago, we sort of shifted from this notion of conditional housing opportunities for community members, bless you, to saying, to this housing first model, to say it doesn't make sense to tell people, after you get sober, or after you get a job, or after X, Y, and Z, then you can have housing. It makes sense to realize that having housing makes it a whole lot easier to get sober, to get a job, or to get any of those types of things. We're trying to pilot what I think of as as an employment first type of model, because a lot of our workforce programs kind of center around that same type of conditionality. But if we can identify ways for people, whether that's painting over graffiti or cleaning up downtown or cleaning up in the parks or something along those lines, to just start going to work, then that can make it easier to maintain a home. It can make it easier to stay sober. It can make it easier to do to stay engaged in a workforce development program and all the other types of things that we would want to do. One of the core tenets that we have is saying we're going to support, and of course we're providing direct supports to businesses and organizations. It also means we're providing direct supports to families and community members in our city. You mentioned our College Bound St. Paul. That's one of our most exciting things that we're doing to start every child on the pathway to college from birth. That also means, and I love to chat more about it through the course of this call, investing in things like guaranteed income and worker-owned cooperatives and things like that to make sure that we are creating pathways and opportunities for our residents to not only earn an income, but to create wealth.
Thank you for highlighting that exciting array of programs and priorities that you're undertaking in St. Paul. Mayor Steinberg, can I kick it over to you to talk about some of the work happening in Sacramento, California?
Sure. Again, thank you, Nicole, and thank you for CAP for having us for this very important conversation. So I am the proud mayor of the capital city of California, and we are a progressive city. We are a growing and changing city. And yet I look at the ARP funding in light of some of our more painful and honest history. Because like many cities throughout America, even outside of the southern part of the United States, our city, unfortunately, over the decades, had a history of redlining neighborhoods. Through a variety of quote strategies by people who are trying to maintain their power and to frankly discriminate. And as a result, over the course of those decades, we have neighborhoods that are proud, that are diverse, that are strong, but that are also struggling. And when you couple that with the fact that in mid-sized cities, at least in California, where we are separate from counties, which are the subdivisions of the state that provide health and human services, the cities do not. Cities are generally municipal corporations. We collect the tax dollars, we provide basic public safety services, we clean the parks, we provide a little smattering of youth services. We do the utilities, of course, for people. I'm overgeneralizing, but not by much. What's changed now in Sacramento? What has changed is that the people are rightfully demanding that their city not replace traditional core priorities, but dramatically expand what we consider to be our core priorities. It's no longer enough to provide the basic services. Now we must invest directly in workforce development, in affordable housing, in investing in our often forgotten commercial corridors outside of the central city. We must invest in the creative economy. And of course, in California, and I know we're not unique, we have a significant housing and homeless problem. And so since I became mayor 5 years ago, my objective, one chapter at a time, has been to change the arc of the expenditure pattern of our city, not to cut back. I'm not a defunding guy, not to cut back necessarily on public safety, but to add to, again, what we consider core priorities. So through Measure U, which was the sales tax you mentioned in the introduction, and through our ARP funding, we have invested now hundreds of millions of dollars in these categories around, to put it simply, investing in human beings and what it takes to have a better opportunity and better quality of life in our city. We took $112 million of ARP and we put $29 million into revitalizing our small business and commercial corridors. I mean, small businesses, we know, struggled horribly during the pandemic. I meet small business owners. I was with a woman who owns a nail salon in South Sacramento, 25 years. And the back rent, she's owned it, and a loyal clientele and her back rent piled up over the course of the pandemic. And now she can't pay it and is looking for relief. We're helping her now with our ARP funds to be able to continue to operate her neighborhood business. We put $41 million into homelessness and affordable housing construction to do whatever it takes, from shelter to affordable housing, partnering with our county to provide the mental health and substance abuse services. We're putting a lot of money into young people, $19 million into workforce development, career pathways, and into gang prevention. And then the creative economy is becoming a huge staple of our growing Sacramento. We love our sports, our Sacramento Kings, we're proud of despite their struggles. And yet, I would say, great community prioritizes art and culture as much as it takes pride in its sports, because that's also what attracts people to a modern city. And then we had $25 million put left over for our city employees so that we could provide salary increases and benefit increases for people who worked extra hard during this pandemic. But the majority of the money, I guess about 80% of the money, went outward facing into the community in these categories. And it speaks to the power of the federal partnership, because our tax bases here have various limitations, especially in California. And so to be able to institutionalize, I know how tough this is. We've seen what happened with Build Back Better, unfortunately, but it goes to show that if these partnerships can continue in some form over the course of the next number of years, our cities, including my city, will come back even stronger, even better than, not to use the cliche, even better than before the pandemic.
Great, thank you for sharing that. You both talked quite a bit about the various programs that are connecting people and constituents in your communities to economic opportunity and really alleviating poverty. Can you talk a little bit about equity as well, and how you apply an equity lens to the funding decisions you've made with these ARP dollars?
Should I go first on this one, Mayor Carter?
Absolutely, Mayor Steinberg. That's what
I
I
will
was
be
going to say.
brief. So it's not just about the money. It's also about how you integrate the money with the policy. And so we are in the process of a community-driven and a community-led initiative to develop a racial equity lens for every budget decision we make in our city, so that there could not be any unconscious or subconscious or subliminal decisions that are made that are contrary to our goal and our desire around the urgency of investing in communities and in people who have long been disadvantaged. That racial equity tool, we want it to be both complex and deep, and at the same time easily utilized by our budget staffs, by policymakers, so that we can say, if we're putting $10 million into the creative economy, exactly where is it going? How many diverse artists, young artists, or artists of all ages are benefiting, and what neighborhoods throughout the city are seeing the impact of these new dollars. So we're trying to formalize a racial equity tool. I'm not sure exactly what it's going to look like yet, that will make us and make our successors analyze every time we make a major decision what the impact is. And if the impact hurts people of color or is neutral, then the policymakers are going to have to make their decision in light of that transparent and public information.
For us, equity has been a core staple of our administration. In addition to the college savings accounts initiative you mentioned, Nicole, in my introduction, we have doubled youth jobs funding. We've tripled free after-school programs in our recreation centers. We've eliminated late fines in our libraries. One of the things that happened early as a capital city as well, my first year as mayor, one of my staffers came in my office and said, "Mayor, do you want fireworks on the 4th of July?" I said, "Absolutely." Because I love the fireworks, and they said it's going to cost us $100,000, and I said, "Well, absolutely not." And just a couple of weeks later, we were able to find $100,000 to launch a legal defense fund for immigrants and refugees in our community, and of course, who at the time were being targeted by the Trump administration. All that to say, is a friend of mine who actually works in progressive politics looked at me and said, "Well, isn't this an equity thing? Because Black children and white children and low-income children and higher-income children and children in every neighborhood can see the fireworks just the same," which was to me a real epiphany that we had to define what we mean by equity, because a lot of people mistake equity for something else. And we started by saying, well, equity is what we do when we intentionally dismantle the persistent disparities that exist in our community. But even that wasn't enough for me, because a lot of times in the social justice world, Nicole, we don't really have a solid a standard definition of equity. For me, I went to business school in undergraduate, and my dean of my business school, her definition of equity was anything but amorphous. When she said equity, she meant ownership, she meant decision-making power, and she meant participation in an economy. If I own equity in a company and that company has a good quarter, then I have a good quarter as well. So that's what we've established as our definition of equity. When we advance equity in St. Paul, it means that we are making sure that every resident, every family, every child, and every community of every part of our city knows that they are owner stakeholders in our cities, in our entire community, that they have a part and a role to play in the critical decisions that are made, whether that's budgeting or policy, and that through those two agreements, we know that, for example, when the city of St. Paul gets a significant $166 million infusion of cash through American Rescue Plan dollars, it's not just that the city, whatever that is going to be better off. It's that the group of people within that city should be better off as well. It ought to be easier for our residents to pay the rent. That's why launching a piloting guaranteed income with these funds are really critical. That's why saying, how do we help workers think about converting the place that they work for into a worker-owned cooperative, so they can not only maintain their jobs and their employment while business owners are looking to retire, but that they can also build an opportunity to continue to build shares of ownership and build equity for themselves. So that's where a lot of this is. So a lot of the investments that we make, we really believe, certainly re-envisioning public safety, are things that are incredibly relevant to equity, but a significant part of that success to be able to get to those policies in the end center for me around what the process is that gets us there, how we ensure that we're engaging people in the decision-making process. We do what we call budget games every year in St. Paul. Every budget that I've brought to our city council has been built by hundreds of residents working together to establish the values that it should represent. Every member of my cabinet has been hired through what we call our community-based hiring process, where hundreds of residents come together and help us source candidates and do the first round of interviews and bring me a slate of finalists. This is all centered around, like I said at the beginning, our residents need to know that they're owners, that they're the owners of our community, that they have real decision-making power. And with regard to ARP, it's not just the sort of general things. We're actually building a panel of folks who will be responsible for bringing recommendations to me and to the city council on programming for millions of dollars of investments that we're going to bring forward. Those community, they're called sort of neighborhood safety community priorities that we're inviting local nonprofits to bring proposals for. That a group of community members will be the ones sitting and hearing those and like walking through those and making the ultimate decisions. So that's ultimately the goal for us, is not to say how do we serve these communities better, but when we see communities that we know our government, our city, our state, our federal governments have historically underserved, our question is always how do we identify those populations, those neighborhoods, those communities as a primary opportunity to engage more people in the decision-making process.
Thank you both for those really innovative remarks and efforts that you're undertaking in both of your cities. I want to ask you a bit of a short-term and long-term two-part question, so I hope you'll bear with me on this one. So critics of the American Rescue Plan have talked about both the need to maximize funds and ensure they're spent in a timely manner. Both of your locations have done a great job with that. So what advice would you give to other state and local officials who want to similarly creatively maximize their funds? And in addition to that kind of short-term goal, there have also been questions about long-term sustainability of programs that are temporary investments. So what thoughts do you have about how to sustain the innovation and economic recovery that you have started with these American Rescue Plan dollars?
Maybe I'll jump back in there to keep our pattern going there, Steinberg.
Okay.
I think it's an important question because a lot of the things that we are doing with American Rescue Plan dollars, we don't necessarily have the ability to sustain it forever. We're counting, knock on wood, on this pandemic crisis not sustaining forever. So there really is a need for the immediate kind of infusion, even to the point that that's a one-time infusion. I'm not arguing that there's not a need for more ongoing direct support for cities and communities, and in particular for the businesses and families that exist within. I do think that that's a powerful thing. That's a powerful need, but it's not one that should be used to argue against the need for investments right now at such a critical moment where we are. I think one of the things that's really true, and one of the things that we've rehearsed here in St. Paul, is that while everything has changed over the past 2 years, also nothing has changed over the past 2 years. What we've seen over the past 2 years are a number of individuals and families who have succumbed to a disease that they did not have the resources or the medicine or the care to overcome. Frankly, that's not new in our country. We've seen people lose their homes, lose their jobs, lose their businesses through no fault of their own, and we've in particular seen significant disparities with regard to who is losing their homes. That's not new. The magnitude may be new, and the convergence of these things happening at the same time may be new, but the function itself is not new. We've seen, sadly, and right here in Minnesota, we've seen unaggressive African-American men lose their lives at the hands of law enforcement. I wish that was new in our country. We have seen, ultimately what I'm saying is, while we are investing right now to address the right now impacts of a very real crisis that's impacting our country right now, the underlying challenges that this crisis has exploited have been ongoing for a very long time. Our hope is that what we've learned as a country and what we've learned as a city is what we've experienced over these last couple of years, is that as long as one of our neighbors can't afford to go to the doctor when they have symptoms, as long as one of our neighbors can't take a week off to isolate or to quarantine or care for a sick child, as long as one of our neighbors can't afford a stable home to shelter in place when it's time to quarantine, that we're literally all less safe. And so, we do believe that and I'm hopeful that we'll work together to make the arguments in Washington, D.C. that we need to sustain and, establish some of these things like the child tax credit permanently, because it's just helping American families. As far as investing those resources now, making that plan early is, I think, critical. Bringing in community partners is, I think, critical. And this is one of those scenarios we're having for every investment we put within it. having a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C is very critical. Our goal from the beginning, and Mayor Steinberg said it exactly, is to not just have these funds benefit sort of the city with a capital C, the city as an entity, but get them out into as far into our community as humanly possible, so that our residents, so that our mothers, so that our business leaders, so that our workers can put them to use. And believe me, once we started that exercise, we found there's really no shortage of need in our community. Mayor Steinberg?
Thank you, Mayor Carter. Yeah, I agree obviously with everything you said. In terms of advice to other cities about how to get the money out effectively and timely, I think it's have a vision, know what you want to do before you receive the money, at least have a generalized idea of the categories. And then, as Mayor Carter talked about, every city does it in a different way. It's really about getting that money to the community-based organizations, to your trusted intermediaries who know about the woman who is struggling to keep her 25-year nail salon open, and many like her. And that's what we've done in our city. We had the pre-existing relationships with the community-based organizations. And, my job was to define the categories and then, in an imperfect way, sort of take the resources we had and say, well, 10 million here, 12 million here, and not get so caught up in making it perfect that you lose that energy and the momentum to get it out to the community so that they can figure out where exactly best to spend it with the right kind of accountability. The issue of one time is a catch-22 because admittedly, this source of funding is one time. So I always say to people, well, what's the choice here? I guess we could turn the money away and not get started with anything that is innovative or creative, and then you would have nothing. I think success begets success. I think when you show when we show the impact of these dollars, that whether it's the next round of federal stimulus, knock wood, whether it's the growing surplus, fortunately, in our state, in the state of California, whether it's our decisions on how we spend what you call our Measure U funding, our sales tax funding in years ahead, that these kinds of investments will prove to be worth continuing to make. The last thing I would say on this, though, I believe money is crucial, obviously, but as I go back, as we said earlier, I think money isn't the only thing. The law needs to change in so many respects in our country. I mean, thank God that we had our forebears fight for civil rights, and we have the Civil Rights Acts, and we have progressive laws, civil rights laws since then. But I look at the housing issue, for example, and I look at the thousands of people who are homeless in our state and in our country, and I ask myself, why isn't housing not just a human right, but a legal right? Why isn't housing guaranteed in some way, not necessarily socialized, working with the private sector? Why aren't cities, counties, states, and our country required as a matter of law to ensure that there is enough dignified shelter and/or housing for every American? The law is as important as the money, because when the law changes and it requires something, the money often follows. So we were hopeful that through Build Back Better, we can still say that, right? Build Back Better, that there was going to be $150 billion for housing. That was in one of the drafts. And of course, it doesn't happen. And, politics. But if housing were a legal right in this country, then the country would have to find a way to fund it. And I just think we should focus on law as much as we focus on money, and the two end up going together. Thank you.
Thank you both for really narrowing us in on how there's such an important need for a vision and a plan, as well as kind of connections within and amongst communities who are reaping the benefits of this really important economic investment. I want to bring in Jean Sperling, the coordinator in the White House for the American Rescue Plan. and go back to those points about, on the national level, what are we learning about the vision and the plan and the impact of these dollars across the country? So thank you so much, Jean Sperling, for being here today. And we look forward to hearing from you about what we've learned on the national level within this past year.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for CAP doing this. I'm proud that I was, I believe, the first senior economic fellow at CAP 2,000 years ago. But I really appreciate the focus that you've had, not only on the American Rescue Plan, but on its elements, particularly on equity, and now this focus on the state and local. And it's been great listening to the two mayors. I had to be a little late because I was in with the president, but I've been able to listen to some of their presentation and read about what their cities had been doing. Let me make some very basic points, which I think are critical, which is the American Rescue Plan, as is true of the state and local portion of the American Rescue Plan, have always had two goals. One was to jumpstart a very strong and equitable recovery, and two was to ensure that that recovery would be durable, that it could overcome bumps in the road, and that there was enough resources to help deal with lingering impacts from the pandemic. And I think we've seen the wisdom and the success on both accounts. So you hear all the time the president and the administration, talk about the fact that 6.7 million is the most jobs ever created in a year, the largest drop in unemployment to 3.8%. But I think one of the things that you're hearing the president talk more about was the notion of this as, if I can use a slightly wonky phrase, a kind of anti-scarring recovery, a recovery that minimizes the amount of long-term harm that we see in downturns. This is one of the painful realities of recoveries, is that not everyone recovers. And after the Great Recession, as you know, President Obama tried valiantly to get more resources, particularly when the recovery was slowed down by foreign challenges due to higher gas prices with the Arab Spring, or European and the Greece challenges, all those things, but that funds weren't there. And what that meant is that you saw long-term unemployment stay high, you saw youth unemployment rate stay above 12% for an extended period of time. And what we know, scholars tell us, what we know is that people do not necessarily ever fully recover from that type of harm in a recovery. Thus the phrase economic scarring. We also know that's true for foreclosures, for evictions. So let's look at this recovery in that light. This is the largest drop in long-term unemployment ever recorded. It was actually rising when the American Rescue Plan was passed. It's dropped almost 2.5 million people, largest drop. Youth unemployment, rather than staying in double digits, has dropped, largest drop. Hispanic and African-American employments both had historic drops, and foreclosures actually reached their all-time lows in 2001, and evictions, thanks to the emergency rental assistance, instead of having a tsunami of evictions after the end of the moratorium, actually have been at 60% of historic levels. Now, what that means is that this is a recovery where you're going to have less of the long-term lingering pains, which is not just bad for our economy. It's not just the more wonky economic phrase hysteresis. It's about reducing the human suffering. And I think this is something that the president, when he was vice president, was very conscious of, these long-term impacts. And there was a conscious effort by the president, by the Congress, to have a strong enough recovery that we didn't just see top-line numbers rise. We saw really one of those rare situations where all boats really were lifted to a strong degree and long-term harm was minimized. Secondly, in terms of the second goal, is it an enduring recovery? Well, some people said to me, did you overlearn the lessons last time by having 2 tranches on the state and local, or having enough not just to get out of a deep hole in 2001, but did you overlearn the lessons by trying to have funds to ensure that you could still have a stable, strong recovery in 2022 and 2023? I don't know how people ask that question, because we're 1 year out and we've already had Omicron, Delta, and Putin invasion of Ukraine. I mean, how much more evidence do you need of the wisdom of ensuring that you have enough of a cushion to help deal with things that could have otherwise derailed the economy? And let's be clear, the American Rescue Plan didn't cause Delta, didn't cause Omicron, didn't cause whether China now shuts down some of its supply chains, or whether Putin invades. It didn't cause those things. What it's doing is helping the economy not get derailed by them. And it also ensures that these mayors and these governors have resources to deal with lingering impacts. So after the Great Recession, we saw that there were communities that were hard hit by deep foreclosures, but too many states and cities didn't have resources to actually deal with them. Now there are some resources to deal with learning loss, to deal with mental health challenges with children coming from the pandemic, dealing with helping more people get back into the workforce, or dealing with some of the pre-existing homelessness and affordability challenges. So I think that it is very important to see the American Rescue Plan as addressing those 2 goals very consciously, and that it has done so wisely, I think, in retrospect. Now, of course, the argument will be that, we're right now facing higher gas prices. Gas prices are $1 higher than they were on January 17th, when Putin started amassing troops in Belarus. Obviously everywhere across the globe in major economies, you're seeing supply chains issues and higher prices, higher inflation. But when you look at 2 actually careful studies, the San Francisco Federal Reserve and Moody's, they found that the American Rescue Plan contribution was less than 1/3 of 1 point, less than 1/3 of 1 point. I see people casually make larger assertions based on any differential between the US and Europe. But I think that is, but if you look again at the San Francisco Fed and Moody's, they're finding that it was less than 1/3 of a percentage. Of course, that is the fact people are dealing with higher prices is a great, challenge for everyone, and something that we're doing everything we can, both in the short term and in the long term, to help address. Last thing I just say is that, on some of these state and local plans, or the K through 12, there's been an implication at times by folks, well, since some states have given tax cuts, maybe that shows that you never should have done the $350 billion state and local plan. Well, let's, first of all, talk to mayors in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or Detroit or the governor of Hawaii or others, cities and counties across this country that were on the verge of layoffs, of cutbacks before the American Rescue Plan passed. It was not a luxury for them. It was a lifeline for them. When you look at what's happening with those funds right now, what you do see is what you've seen from the mayors here. The Center for Budget and Policy Priorities estimates 78% of states have already allocated, appropriated the funds. 80% for the top 20 cities, they have appropriated 80% of both their first and second tranche. So these funds are being used for very important and challenging, taking on important challenges. And so I think it's really, one should be very, very skeptical of those who take a high view and say, since a few places gave tax cuts, you don't need, this money was not needed. I mean, first of all, let's look at the following. the state budget officials organization estimated that revenues would be up 4% before the American Rescue Plan passed. The American Rescue Plan worked. It surged jobs, it surged growth, it surged revenues. Revenues then went up 14.5%, not 4%. Because of that success, several places have surpluses. Some of them are doing things with those surpluses that not all of us would support. But that doesn't mean that it was a mistake to have done the American Rescue Plan. That is like saying, I always bring my umbrella out and I never get wet in the rain. So therefore, why am I bringing an umbrella out? The American Rescue Plan helped surge those revenues growth that was not predicted before that. Last two things I'll just say are that I think, one of the examples of things that were very innovative in the American Rescue Plan that looked hard, were challenging, had a bit of startup challenges, but now I think have to be looked at as extremely successful experiments in progressive government is the emergency rental assistance. I mean, our nation never had a national infrastructure to help prevent evictions. Our nation never had a nationwide strategy to prevent evictions during a serious downturn, never before. So of course, when you start that up in over 400 jurisdictions, it's going to be a little messy, it's going to be a little difficult. But let's look where we are now. 4.3 million major payments to renter households and their families, preventing evictions and utilities being turned off in the middle of the winter. There has never been anything like that in our country. And in fact, when people talk about expanding the safety net or what I like to call the dignity net, they often forget about evictions. And yet here, as difficult and challenging and again, messy as it's been, and as much lessons as we're going to learn when we look back, this has been a major positive, novel effort by progressive government to ensure that we're making evictions a last resort, not a first resort. And in doing so, preventing enormous long-term harm to families. So I have so much more I'm going to say, but I'm going to stop now because I know maybe we'd like to get in a few question and answers. So thank you so much to Patrick and Cap for hosting this. And I'm happy to take questions as long as people, or be part of Q&A as long as people are willing. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all of those really interesting remarks on what we have really seen and learned over this past year, not only of the impact across the country, but on essential jobs, essential services, and really a robust economic recovery. So thank you for sharing those lessons and impacts and a lot of the creative programs that have started as part of this funding. So I will ask one question that I've seen asked a couple of different ways in the chat, which is really about two different types of partnerships. One is we have with us today two mayors who have talked about programs they have done in their cities. There's a question about what type of, if any, regional programs have been part of this funding to go kind of across cities, counties, states, and related question about any public-private partnerships that have taken place in any of your cities or Jean across the country that have been really good models and that have good guardrails surrounding them to make sure that the private business work is on behalf of the public and the whole city and not just on behalf of people who already have those connections to private industry.
Well, I'll make a couple of very quick points and then let the mayors answer. The issue of whether people are doing kind of cross-state initiatives, I do not know as much on that. Obviously, some of those things often take a longer period of time. In the Obama administration, we did the manufacturing innovation hubs, which has fortunately been part inspiration to the Endless Frontiers bill. And there people had time to do applications where they would combine across states. But let me give you examples of where we have seen cooperation. On the housing and homelessness side, we have definitely seen where counties and cities are merging their American Rescue Plan funds. I think you see that quite a lot. Mayor Adler talks about what they've done with the surrounding county in the Austin area on the economic diversion programs, which are to ensure that in the court process, rather than going right to eviction, there's a diversion process. That has involved states and counties working with courts in ways that they never have before. And we're seeing partnerships with legal services, 99 different law school clinicals, and cities and counties. So I think that there has been more of this kind of cooperation between different parts of government, for example, in the housing area, that have not often talked together. But I think there will be lessons learned. I think if I had it over again to do, I would have had a portion of the emergency rental assistance perhaps go more directly to courts and to right to counsel areas, so that they would have been bought in and part of the picture from the start. And as much as a fan as I am of the American Rescue Plan, I think it's incredibly important that we also do look analytically at what we could do better. I would have liked to see more last mile specific funding. I think the mayor's talked about the trusted messengers. When you're trying to get funds out immediately, like with the child tax credit, like with the emergency rental assistance, you've got very little time to set up the infrastructure. Again, more funding that directly goes to people who I like to think of, it's the last mile is the hardest, not just for broadband, for everything. So trusted messengers in trusted places. That would be one of the lessons that I think we encouraged it. I think in the future, I'd rather see more funding directly going to the navigators, counselors, last mile strategies.
Jane, I would certainly agree with that. I'll tell you, as a mayor who's been in office since 2018, the difference between the CARES Act program that was enacted and the American Rescue Plan dollars that we have, the flexibility that we have, the longer term time horizon that we have to work with them, it tells me that there's a whole lot of work that's gone into thinking of kind of best practices and improvements. And it's exciting to hear that you still have kind of things on top of that. But I want to give some credit where credit is due, where that's concerned as well. I was going to use our housing partnership even before you said it, Gene, as my example of an incredible partnership that's come together. We saw our unsheltered population in St. Paul increase by a factor of 10 in just a couple of weeks when at the start of the pandemic. In the summer of 2019, we were monitoring about 29 people in tents in our city. In the summer of 2020, that number spiked over 380. It was really staggering for us to see that many tents across our community. And we were able, and the body of work that we've sort of inherited centers around either sort of setting up porta potties and helping people be comfortable as possible, or sort of bringing in bulldozers and arresting people, neither of which seemed acceptable for us. So the ability to partner with our county, to partner with nonprofit and for-profit, kind of mental health providers and service providers and shelter providers, to have the resources there to rent hotel rooms and all the different type of spaces that we need. Frankly, we ended up repurposing recreation centers as temporary shelters because as a cold weather city, we last winter lost 5 lives just because people couldn't find a safe, warm place to sleep. And then, Gene, I mentioned before you got on this call, this past, I think in December, we partnered with our county, Ramsey County, to announce a coordinated investment of $74 million of American Rescue Plan Act funds, half with the city and half the county, to provide and to establish funding for over 1,000 new units of deeply affordable housing. This is all done in partnership, and it's one of these examples of something that can be bigger and better because we're able to find that synergy across partners in a way that without American Rescue Plan dollars, none of it, we couldn't even conceive of making a big investment like that we all know that we need.
Yeah, and I just have to say quickly before the mayor goes in, when I see things like that, like 74 million, Ramsey County and St. Paul coordinating, such an amazing type of cooperative, 1,000 units. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And then to just have people casually say, oh, maybe the state and local funds were too big because they read about a couple of states giving tax cuts with their surplus. It's really, I feel like saying to all of them, come talk to the mayors of St. Paul and Sacramento, I just got back from speaking at the National League of Cities, talk to them about how much pain they were in before the American Rescue Plan passed, but because they have resources and the time and at least a few years to spend it, the innovative things they're doing. I'm sorry, Mayor Steinberg, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I've listened to you all day. I mean, it's great. I was just going to say, to pick up on your point, I do think that there is a fine line between the federal government empowering local governments to spend this money, this life-saving money, in ways that maximize effectiveness according to local need and local custom, and the federal government maybe even being a little bit more directive at times, especially around homelessness, to insist that cities and counties pool their money, for example, because, and that is a fine line. But I have come to the belief, having served both at high levels of state government and now in local government, that a little bit more direct authority from the federal and state government, at least around the outcomes that you expect, is appropriate. Because sometimes when you are hoping that jurisdictions are going to work to the maximum levels of collaboration and cooperation because of culture, because of history, because of personalities, it doesn't always happen. Now, in our instance, a lot of it did happen, especially around the rental assistance of money, right? That got out city, county-wide. But I do think that there is a policy role for the federal government around housing specifically. And I don't get to talk to you often, but why isn't housing not just a human right, but a legal right in this country? Why is this a voluntary act of government? To say housing is an economic commodity, do the best you can with the resources you have, prices go up, that's the way it is. Housing is a life essential, just like food is. And man, when there is a natural disaster affecting the middle class or the upper middle class, we come in with modular homes, we come in with the Red Cross, we come in with FEMA, and we take care of people. We don't do the same thing as a country when it comes to the people who are the poorest of the poor. And I think more policy leadership from the federal government, in addition to the generous dollars, would take us even further the next time.
So there is no doubt, and I think you both know this, that the overwhelming bipartisan push from mayors and governors and county leaders was, and you can say it in one word, flexibility.
Yes.
I cannot tell you how many times I heard some version of New York, New Mexico, and New Orleans all have different needs, et cetera. And look, I think that as a person in charge of implementing the American Rescue Plan, I took the legislation as it was, and you're right in that a lot of there's not as many, for better or worse, and both better and worse, there's not as many sticks and carrots in this legislation. We have, however, tried to use our full force of whether it's bully pulpit or guidance to try to move things. I think the emergency rental assistance was something where, across the country, there were places where the applications were too complicated, it was taking a while. We really did do everything in our power to help push for simpler, application, self-attestation, while still keeping, integrity controls. I think in the state and local, there was a lot of push because of the CARES Act, to allow for revenue loss replacement, which gives a lot of flexibility. And there were provisions in eligible uses. But I will say, as you mention it, I think when we sit here at this part, and I say this as, American Rescue Plan coordinator, there are a lot of great things that people are doing with the American Rescue Plan dollars, and people are doing the right things. But I do think you start to see emerging a few priorities that that I think we are trying to promote a little more, and would like to see more collaborative national effort on sharing best practices. And I think one is workforce, which is bringing people back to better jobs, better wages, encouraging people back. Particularly, the president talks about the fact that we're going to have hundreds of thousands of new jobs from the infrastructure bill. Are people using their American Rescue Plan dollars to make sure we're not just bringing people back, but we'll be ready for a diverse workforce for that? Secondly, is it's really, the amount of creative, interesting violence prevention strategies that I know you all have been involved in is quite, something around the country. And some of that's been hiring, bringing back police officers, but, a lot of that has been, very, strategies that have to do with prevention, have to do with combining, mental health specialists, peer, networks, et cetera. A lot of different ideas. So that's another second area. But I think the third is, as you said, housing and homelessness. We are inheriting in this crisis what was already an affordable housing shortage. We were inheriting what is already a serious homelessness issue. So I'm very glad that the resources there aren't like the initial CARES Act where you had to spend it all in a year. You do have time, and you are coordinating with your counties and doing more. But I do think that that some of the mobilization we will try to do going forward will be focused a lot in these three areas of workforce, of violence prevention, and homelessness prevention, and building the starts of the affordable housing. Though, as you say, the provisions in Build Back Better are obviously much more substantial and longer lasting, but there's a lot that still can be done with the resources that are out there. And I think we really are trying to, push gently in those directions as more national priorities, in addition to being city and county specific priorities.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And I want to thank all the panelists today for the remarks and insights they've shared with us about the many creative ways that these funds have been used in very needed ways to get an economic recovery for all Americans, to get this country back on track, and to have these vital investments be used in the best way possible. We have done some initial data as well here at the Center for American Progress, and we have a report that's going to be released later today that is talking about the many ways that these plans and dollars have improved lives for all Americans, eased hardships for millions of Americans, and demonstrated the real need for further investment for long-term equitable economy that works for everyone. So we hope everyone will go to our website and see that report. You can also go to americanprogress.org/events to rewatch this conversation or to learn more about the American Rescue Plan or economic recovery more generally. And I really want to take a moment again to thank all of our panelists for really showing us the model here of the creative and important ways and impact this American Rescue Plan has had for all Americans. So thank you again for joining us for the important conversation, and look forward to continuing conversations.